So good day everyone. Today we're going to continue our lesson in the major genres of literature. Today we're going to talk about poetry. Now, poetry is the oldest form of literature, in this case English literature. So basically, as the last week we talked about prose, there are two ways to define it. The first is against the prose, meaning we focus on the characteristics that are not available to prose and is special to poetry. That is usually about the verses, the rhyme, and the meter. So more so towards the lyrical qualities, the verse qualities of poem. That is how we define poetry. So another way to define poetry is to look at the things, the characteristics that are similar to prose. That is to say, the syntax structure, that is the sentence structure, and the rhetoric elements of it, basically the language elements of it, which are quite similar. Now, if you look at the traditional uh, attributes or characteristic of poetry, the verses, rhyme, and meter, this works really well to look at to analyze the traditional poem because all of them are real lyrical and they're written in verses instead of paragraphs like you would see in a prose. However, the newer kinds of poetry, the more modern one, may be using experimental verses, or maybe they don't rhyme, or maybe they don't use the meter. The meter here means the length of a line in a verse, the sound quality, the acoustic qualities of poetry. Now, if you write uh, modern poetry, usually you don't really care about the how long is your verse, what is the rules that your verses use, or what kind of rules that you use for the rhyme or the meter, because you want to focus on the meaning of a poetry. Now, if you do so, the more useful tool to analyze the modern, that is to say, the free and experimental kind of poetry, is to look at its sentence structure, the rhetoric parts, and basically the meaning. So you're doing an analysis a bit more similar that you do on the prose. You look at the meaning, you look at the plot, you look at the settings, stuff like that. But of course, in a poetry analysis, we don't call it a plot. Of course, that is what you do in a prose. You don't call it a setting. We use different terms than those. We don't use characters. We don't use the term characters. We use another term that is more specific and more appropriate for poetry, because poetry is different than prose, so it has to be treated differently to get the full analysis of poetry. Now, let us move on to the kinds of poetry. The first is the narratical poetry. It tells of a story. We talked about the epic before, and there is also the uh, poem form of romance, that is to say, the verse form of romance, and also ballads. Ballads are similar to epic, but shorter in length and less complex. So it tells of story, this narratical poetry. Now, what we usually see about poetry is the lyrical poetry. So if the narratical poetry tells a story, the lyrical poetry is mainly concerned with an event, an impression, or an idea. So this is where the strength of the poetry really lies. So when you, for example, you feel great emotions, you feel great anger or great happiness, perhaps the best way to express it is not through prose, but through poetry. When you really love someone, for example, or when you really hate them, or when you have an event that is very strange, perhaps it does not really, you don't really have a time to write a complete paragraph or a complete short story for it. But the feelings, the great feelings, the great idea or a great event that you just had is perhaps better told in just a few verses, a few lines that really captures the power of the moment. So that is the strength of the poetry, because it is written in such an artful form, the artful form of speech instead of the day-to-day language. It can capture a very powerful sensation that prose does not uh, do. So the prose relies on the storytelling to deliver the great impact, but poetry relies just on a few words and a few lines to deliver a powerful impact. So if you see your holy books, if you see the holy books of religions, of many religions, they are written in the poetry form, usually in the verses, because they deal with something great, something powerful to be told in a very efficient way. They are very condensed, the form of the poetry. You don't see poetry in pages. Normally, they would be most commonly one page, two page, perhaps three pages. Except, of course, the narratical poetry, which actually tells of a story. But the lyrical poetry is meant to have first to be concerned with something powerful, something important, and they are lyrical. They're meant to be performed in a way that when you read it aloud, there is a certain rhythm, there is a certain set of sound features. So it makes sense for the early literature because uh, the early literature has usually are not written but memorized, one, and that two, usually early literature does not have a printing press ready, so they are usually in the form of poetry, and also that they are very powerful. Yes, so early literature in the form of riddles, chants. That is, you see the whole power of chants and charms is that there are repetitions of certain sounds that make it appear magical. So when you repeat certain sounds, and you make it like there is a melody, there is a rhythm to it. It touches you on a deeper level than just saying words that do not have those same melodic or rhythmic qualities to it. Chants and charms usually work with intended to have spiritual effects, magic or otherwise, and also elegy, which is the kind of recital or a poem that is recited uh, regarding someone's death or someone's passing. The ode, which um, is a serious poem, yes, it's a serious poem that talks about an idea or a topic in a view controlled verses. The sonnet, which is usually written in stanzas, in long stanzas, sorry, in long stanzas, and usually deal with love, with human love, worldly love, instead of the spiritual. And most modern poetry are also lyrical. It deals with the sound, acoustic, onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeia Onomatopoeia. Probably it's a bit hard to pronounce that one. Onomatopoeia. So it deals with a sound that is similar to what you hear in nature. For example, the sounds that animals make. In the book, you'll find the example of the cuckoo, the cuckoo, the cuckoo. So it tries to mimic a bird. So when a bird tries to mimic the reality in terms of sound, that is what onomatopoeia. Usually it deals with animal sounds or natural sounds. And as you would expect, the ballads, for example, the ode, sometimes you can turn that into song form. And most modern songs derive their rhythmical, their melodic qualities from early poetry. And some poetry are also meant to be sung. This is why you have a lot of rules regarding how you should arrange the words in a poetry. Now, the free and modern poetry, the free poetry, the modern poetry, they don't really care about the melodic and the rhythm and the meter. They just focus on the content usually, not all, but usually, because the songs are already taking care of that. The popular song, the modern songs, you just cannot put, if you ever written a song, you don't just put words at random. You have to think about melody, you have to think about rhythm, you have to think about how long one line has to be said before another, how to put the emphasis on certain lines, etc., and certain verses, etc. So that is why the rules regarding the sound and the lyrical quality of poetry is sometimes complicated, because you want to make the best performance out of this kind of poetry. So the main, what you call that, element in a poem is imagery. Imagery is a predominantly visual component. Visual meaning from the eye, but it can also include other sensory impressions, the smell, the touch, etc. And the most common manifestation of the concrete character of poetry. So you want to talk about what a poem is about. So let me make things very clear here. Poetry is the subject. Yes, the whole topic. Poem is the particular product of poetry. We call that a poem. The person who make poems, we call them poet, just so that we understand that. So let me repeat. Imagery is the most common manifestation of the concrete character of poetry. When you talk about how good a poetry is, you usually talk about its imagery. When you talk about the quality of poems, when you talk about poems in general, you usually refer to the imagery of it. Even abstract theme, for example, talking about honor, talking about duty, talking about love, abstract, non-concrete abstract things are things you cannot directly see or touch or use your five senses to know about it, but you can feel it. Things like thoughts, minds, philosophy, love, etc., politics. Even abstract themes have to use concrete imagery to make it more accessible. Uh, every poetry usually uses some sort of they say some things in their uh, poems. In the poems, you see nouns, you see things that are mentioned there. Concrete imagery is something like that. What does this symbolize? Why do you have to mention A, B, or C? We will go over that in detail in just a bit. So there are three levels of imagery here: the lexical, thematic, thematic. I think is the most better pronunciation. Lexical, thematic, lexical, thematic, the visual, and the rhythmic acoustic. So for this first video, we're going to talk about the thematic, lexical thematic level before we go on to the next video with the visual, and perhaps the more technical one is the rhythmic and acoustic. So to give you an idea of an imagery in a poem, we look at Emily Dickinson's poem, very famous. Emily Dickinson is an early American poet, and her poems, they don't have titles. It was published after her death, so she never published her poems, but her poems were very powerful and very original. Although she never meant them to be published, It was published by her, I think her relative, her brother, if I'm not mistaken. It was collected by her friends as well, through letters, etc. And then was finally published and gained uh, an international fame because the power of it. So let's look at them and try to understand what is imagery. Fame is a fickle food upon a shifting plate whose table once a guest, but not the second time is set, whose crumbs the crows inspect and with our ironic caw flap past it to the farmer's corn. Men eat of it and die. So obviously I did not do a very good poetic reading of it. I didn't put too much feeling into it. So the best recitation of a poem is that is the one that has soulful feelings put into those words, and by that poetic recitation, poetic reading, you want the audience to get the sense of it. Perhaps I would do perhaps the first two lines, I think, to give you an idea. Fame is a fickle food upon a shifting plate, whose table once a guest, but not the second time is set. So that's probably a better poetic reading out of it. So the first thing that you do is you highlight certain items when you perform a poetic reading, and you also look at the rhymes and look at the meaning of it to get you a better understanding of the poetry of the poem, and then try to emulate that through the intonation of your reading of the poem. So those are the basics of poetry reading, but here we're going to focus more on the imagery, as I said before. Fame is a fickle food, the first line. So the imagery here is food and how food becomes fickle. Fickle is actually the property, the attribute, the characteristics of living things. Fickle is usually about humans. Food cannot be fickle because it is not a living thing. And fame is a fickle food tells you a lot about fame. This is the imagery. Let's focus on this imagery. Fame is a fickle food. It is something to be eaten in a table, in a dining table. So, do people need to eat food to survive? Yes. So fame is a necessity. Humans have to eat food to survive. In this case, humans have to eat, quote unquote, they have to eat fame to survive. However, it is not a healthy food, it is not a bad food either, but it is a fickle food. Fickle means unreliable. You cannot trust something that is fickle. You cannot really own or really have something that is fickle. If you have a fickle boyfriend or a girlfriend, that person will cheat on you and probably not a good candidate for your wife or a husband. So that is fickle. Fickle is changing a lot, not constant and not reliable. It is a negative word. So it is a necessity, yes. Fame is a necessity. You have to eat it, but also you cannot grab it. You cannot have it forever. You cannot, earn it in the right way. You cannot take it with you all the time. It will go away. It will change, and it is not permanent, as it is not constant. So notice in just one sentence, the poetry can tell a lot about things. So this is the strength of the poetry, and this is the imagery of it. There is a concrete thing, the food, the fame, fickleness. You understand what it is, and you can think about them individually. But when put into combination in a verse, in a line, it becomes something else with the use of the rhetoric devices In this case, fame is a fickle food is actually a metaphor. Fickle is a human attribute given to a inanimate object, which is food, so it is a personification. Fickle is personification. The whole sentence is a metaphor. So let us continue with the lexical thematic definition. So the lexical thematic level of poetry have these elements: diction, choice of words; rhetorical figure of speech, the one that I just talked about, the metaphor, the personification, the simile, etc., and the theme. So lexical thematic, lexical means words, thematic, thematic, lexical thematic means about the theme. So we are actually on the level looking at a poem in the terms of its meaning, its imagery in the terms of meaning, and we're talking here about its similarity to the prose, which is in the use of language. So instead of point of view, the first person point of view or third person point of view in prose fiction, we call them the voice in poetry. Instead of characters, you have speaker or speakers. In longer poetic forms like ballads, the narrative situation can be as complex as that of the novel or the short story, but not as much as epics or romance. So in this case, even though the content is a narration, which is very similar to prose fiction, it is actually written in the verse form. So the content is narrative, or like prose, but the form is verse, poetry. So we call them poetries. It has concrete scenery. We call them scenery, not settings, like in prose. We call them scenery. And it uses concrete nouns or things, like you would see the food, the fickle, the fame that you just talked about. Imagery can have symbolism. Of course, here we have two types of symbolism. The conventional symbolism, for example, red usually has something to do with life or pain or heat or warmth or blood, for example. Those are conventional, but also there is the private symbolism. Private symbolism is something like this: fame is a fickle food. You don't usually call fame as food. So when you say in general, in day-to-day situation, you don't really compare food to fame, or vice versa, or otherwise, or fame as food. You have to explain why fame is a fickle food through the medium of the poetry. So the whole poem tells you why fame is fickle food. That can be said to be a private symbolism. You don't usually consider fame as food, but as you explain why in the poem, the audience will get how fame is like food. That is a simpler example of private symbolism there, made by Dickinson. The main difference, however, between poetry and prose fiction is in the poetic language, the condensed, artful form of speech. So one sentence can tell you a lot, unlike the prose fiction. While prose is realistic common speech, so the poetic language is artful, it's very condensed, very, full of figures of speech, the rhetorical figures of speech, while prose is realistic common speech. Now before we go on any further, we need to know what rhetoric means, just to be very clear. Rhetoric or rhetorical, the adjective or rhetoric, is the art of speaking of or writing effectively, such as the study of principles and rules of composition, writing an essay, the study of writing and speaking as means of communication or persuasion, especially persuasion. Rhetoric usually means how to talk things, how to deliver a speech, for example, that is persuasive, instead of just saying things as usual. The second definition, this is from Merriam-Webster, by the way, American Dictionary. It's skill in the effective use of speech, a type or mode of language or speech that is beautiful, that is artful, that is persuasive, that is complex. So rhetoric is like the art of speaking, more or less. And we're going to move on to the rhetorical figures, which has many types, but mostly what we want to focus here is the simile and metaphor, because these are the main important, important types of rhetorical figures. You can some people also call this figure of speech. Yes. Rhetorical figures are widely used in poetry because they produce a non-literal meaning, a deep meaning, a condensed meaning, and reduce abstract or complex tenors to concrete vehicles. The tenor is the idea, the object of the person. Vehicle is the whole image. The tenor, for example, if we have the metaphor there, the chicken president, or the president is chicken. Metaphor means that you substitute one thing for another. A president is a different term, is a different idea than a chicken. But then you say in a metaphor that the president is a chicken. So one thing is another. You substitute one thing for another in a metaphor. In a simile, you say that one thing is like something else. So the substitution in metaphor is direct. President is a chicken, or is a chicken president. You know. About the simile, use the word like. Now, why are these considered different? Now, if you look at the example there, the president is a chicken, or a president is chicken. And you compare that to the saying that president like a chicken. You see you can probably sense the difference nuance of that statement. When you say the president is like a chicken, you know that the president is not exactly a chicken, but perhaps he or she, yeah, before you go on to be angry that I'm saying bad things about the president, let me be very obvious here that I'm not talking about the Indonesian president. So, so take it easy. Don't take everything as political, and don't be ultra sensitive about political things. So yeah, before you get angry about me saying bad things about the president, take a note of that. So the president is like a chicken. You take only one aspect of a chicken. Perhaps a chicken is diligent. Perhaps a chicken is independent. Perhaps a chicken is cowardly. You know, it is afraid of things like you would see in the Western uh, or American conception of chicken is that it is a symbol, a conventional symbol for cowardice. That you're a coward if someone says that you're a chicken, means that you're a coward. But however, when you say the president is like a chicken, you can refer to only one aspect of it, and not the entire entity of a chicken. But when you use metaphor that the president is a chicken, or president is chicken, you know, it's much more powerful, much more closer, and the two becomes one. So the president is chicken. It's like that feathery, small things. So it suddenly refers to all aspects of it. So it may refer to the independence of chicken. It may refer to the insignificance of chicken because this is a small and not a threatening animal. It can refer to the farm. It can refer to the cowardice, and all of those things are added into the attribute of the president. Again, not the Indonesian president, so take it easy, bro. So the president is chicken. So metaphor is more powerful than simile. Well, simile is very choosy, more focused on certain aspects than the whole idea of the chicken. So let's look at the specific elements of this. So the tenor is the independence of chicken, yeah, the smallness. the farm poultry of chicken, the cowardice of chicken, and everything related to the president, the power of a president, the figure of a president, etc. The vehicle is the imagery itself. So the chicken president, or the president is chicken, president like a chicken. So that is the whole vehicle of it. This is the vehicle of it. So it's like the tenor. We can probably put the analogy of a passengers in a car. The passengers are the tenor. So there's the whole idea, for example, here about the fame and fickleness and food. This is a metaphor, by the way. The first line of Dickinson's poem is a metaphor. So the whole sentence, sorry, the whole line, we don't say sentence, yeah, we say lines in a poetry, because it is not stopped by a period. You see, in the first stanza, we don't call it paragraph, we call it stanza, the one verse, yes, one stanza. There is no period there after the first line. Fame is fickle food, no period. Usually after one sentence, you have one period. However, we're not talking about a paragraph, we're talking about the stanza. We're not talking about the sentence, we're talking about a line. Yes? So, fame is a fickle food, that is a metaphor, and the whole thing, this unit, this line, fame is a fickle food, this whole unit of thought is a verse. Yes? Is a metaphor, it is a vehicle. What's inside this vehicle, the passengers in this vehicle, is fame, is fickleness, is food. Those elements of it. So that's one way to think about a vehicle and tenor in this case. So I will continue next with the verbal icon and verbal structure, and we will look at deeper into the one of the example of the ode. Thank you.